So today we have Mohammad Abubakr, who works in the data function at Sadape. He will be going through his story. We'll ask him a bunch of questions. If you have questions that you want to ask him, please put them in the chat and I will curate them in the right order so that it makes sense for everyone. So you can start putting in questions now if you want, or as you think of them. And then I'm going to hand it over to Mohammad Abubakr to tell us his story a little bit, introduce himself. I think he will do it more justice than I'll be able to. And so over to you.
Thank you, Arif. So I'll just get into it. So I joined Sadape about a year ago, but I think that's not really where my journey in data started. I would probably say that my journey with data started back in my bachelor's because I was actually doing a degree in medicine of all things. And then I decided that I did not want to pursue that. I wanted a career in data. So I switched to a career in computer science and data. So for doing that, the first thing that I thought I needed a degree from a university, right? So I went to FAST and I graduated in 2021 from there. And during my bachelor's, I did some data science certification. I think a lot of people do that. So, and also as I was very fascinated by data science and ML, so I did some projects like related to reinforcement learning, related to simple data science, computer vision, and just got to know more and more about like what I could do going forward, right? But then during my bachelor's, I would say COVID hit. So I found an opportunity to create a startup with my own friends. So it is called Mavish Mandi, and we started in COVID, right? So that internship actually that like startup that I founded with my co-founders actually helped me a lot, right? So it helped me get an internship at Bazaar. So if you probably guys would know, there was another similar platform to found in Pakistan, Venture for Pakistan, right? So Venture for Pakistan also was trying to curate early startup talent, and through them, I got a chance to start an internship at Bazaar. I entered Bazaar, and at that time, I was supposed to be a data science intern, but obviously, I could not I did, there was no data science talent over there at that time, right? So what would be the next best thing, right? So I at that point in my career got introduced to the field of data engineering, right? So I became the third engineer at Bazaar, and obviously after a month in my internship, that turned into a full-time role, and I got to work with some fantastic colleagues over there and build a data platform for Bazaar that helped them scale to the heights that they're at now, right? And obviously, I worked there for a year, and I worked in different roles as a data, we can say data analyst, data ops, and also trying to look into ML stuff. So a lot of things to look at that time. And then after that, I got a chance to switch to Sadape. Obviously, at Sadape, there is a complete different in how we work, right? It's a fintech that's regulated by state bank. So a lot of the technology and tools that we use over there are more geared towards that financial aspect and geared towards more towards safety. So yeah, it's been about close to a year at Sadape, and I actually met Rauf through one of your events, like Founder Pakistan's event, where you were hosting a deep learning conversation, and yeah, I got Rauf convinced me that yeah, you have to speak at one of our events and talk to people because there is a lot of people who care a lot about getting into data roles. So here we are.
Okay. So you touched upon Bazaar and Sadape, your experiences, but is there anything else you'd want to maybe enlighten everyone about the Pakistani tech ecosystem and how, how data is used, how sophisticated the ecosystem is versus what are some things that are new?
Okay, so I think that's a pretty good question, right? That like I also when I was starting out, right, I did not like do that like knew that much about this tech ecosystem, and I think that's what most beginners probably miss as well, right? When you are trying to get into the tech field in Pakistan, you should probably look at what's being done here, right? Like if you just look at the industry from a very macro angle, right? It's a very, I would say a nascent, not nascent because it's been there for a while, but a very small industry if you look at it in like sheer numbers terms, right? So you just compare yourself with India next door, right? It's even the outsourcing market over there is like 150 billion or something, right? So they have these big companies, TCSs, their Wipros. I think a company of that size alone is doing the kind of exports that Pakistan, like half or more than a quarter of what Pakistan is doing. The latest numbers I was looking at it, like a whole export, if you look at it in the tech sector, it's probably 15 billion or stuff. I like you can probably check the numbers and probably not the most up to date numbers, but yeah, the government can be more like optimistic about them, and in reality, they can be a lot lower. But yeah, so if you look at the industry right there, right, it's like what I see is that there is normally just a lot of outsourcing being done here, right? You have your small, very small software houses that's like creating apps and like website stuff for small, or I would say up clients outside of Pakistan, right? That they're doing something like they have contracts that are 6 months or less, or and they're just like getting a very small product done, and then they're moving on to the next client, right? So it's not something long term, right? So I also see that it kind of levels removed, right? Somehow it's like some somebody has outsourced it to somebody else, and then there is like probably getting outsourced to somebody else that's a third party in Pakistan, and there's like a whole value chain over there, right? So you're probably ways removed from the actual uh, product or the thing that's being built, right? Then you can probably look at your bigger software houses, right? That are like your Tempers and your systems and your venture dive, right? That are probably doing some better work, right? Because like they have clients that are longer term. They could be like foreign startups that have raised some good amount of funding. There's like medium sized businesses. So I guess over there, like there is still like you can get into a data role, like have a meaty data project, work on something that you can progress your career with, right? Because they normally have contracts that are running for years, right? And also for these startups, it's still cheaper for them to outsource to this particular company. And they are also saying that, okay, you have done your development work for us. Now we can go with you towards like the data stuff as well, right? And if you look more at like the other part, I think because like obviously I work at Sadapay and we are always geared towards freelancers, we're thinking about that. So I think for freelancers is something I also wanted to explore, right? That how as a person who is in the field of data, what's the freelance market out there? So like I created some accounts on like Fiverr and Upwork and just tried to just find what was going on there. And I was, to be honest, a little disappointed because what I saw over there was again, it felt more like the projects that were there available for people. It was more like offline work, right? So what I would say with like what I would give you an example would be like, oh hi, I have this data here, right? It's in these particular Excel files XYZ, and like I want you to do a simple analysis of it, and like or you can build something out of this, and like everything is very static, right? And it's all working on your local machine, and you're like not getting that real experience of something that could be that is being done in production, right? And the other kind of project that I found when I tried to dig a little deeper was that it felt if like it was somebody else's project, and again it was trying to be given to somebody else, right? For example, it felt like somebody it was somebody else's job, and they just were working on something in their job, and they were just trying to find somebody else to give this to, right? So that you're having a timeline of a week or stuff, and you just want to get it done right there and then, right? And I guess after if you like look at this, the biggest like thing that I thought that would be a good thing would be like a startups, right? If you look at startups, I think they were the ones in the industry there that were doing data a lot better than all of the other companies, right? Because for them, their investors were people from abroad, right? And they understood a lot more about how you wanted to make those data-driven decisions, and they had to be on point with that. That's what I experienced at Bazaar as well, right? That they wanted to be on top of data that they like were producing, and they wanted to do more with that, right? How they wanted to be looking at all the touch points of that data, and they also wanted to be like aggregating it and stuff. Like every decision that they would be making, they wanted to make it through data. But there was a big catch there as well, right? Like for these people, they don't like they have a lot of requirements, right? Because like obviously they are growing, and they also are learning stuff when they're doing it, right? It's like you don't have the business 100% figured out. So your data people that are coming in, right? They also have to have that mentality of that learning learning every day, right? Learning new stuff every day. They don't want a particular data scientist or data analyst that knows only SQL, that knows only Excel, or like that knows only about creating dashboards on a particular Tableau or Power BI, and they just want to do that, right? So they want that dynamism because obviously they have tighter budgets, right? A person who is in a startup is a lot of times doing a lot of roles that are not defined. And in that point, I think a person who's starting out as a beginner, that's the point in time that you get to learn the most, right? Because you get to live in that space, in that frame of mind, right? That I am comfortable with the unknowns, right? That every day that I'm going out on the job, I have to learn something, I have to experiment with something, and I'll be learning something. So, in my understanding, that's like how I see quite a stark difference in like tech. If you look at the tech ecosystem in Pakistan in general, and specifically if you're focusing on the data stuff.
Okay, that makes sense. You touched on a few different things that I would want to double click on, but one that was very like one of your last sentences is that things are ever changing. The company is learning because they are also new to this. And then if you are a beginner data, analyst, scientist, engineer, you are also learning. So how much do you think, like you already touched upon, I think a very important factor when working at startups is that you should always be in the mode of learning, and you are, if you are a lifelong learner, you will succeed at startups. But apart from that, because a lot of people are entry level in this call, and some of them are students, what do you advise them on from a mindset perspective other than lifelong learning, like what to be ready for, right? Many people won't know because they haven't worked in the corporate sector, they haven't worked at these outsourcing agencies, and they haven't worked at startups, so they haven't had a job yet. What other mindset should they come in with and be ready for? What was surprising for you that they should be ready for?
So I guess the biggest issue that probably plagued me as well, right? That I the first I think during my introduction I told you very specifically that I myself did not know about the field of data engineering, and I literally got introduced to data engineering over there. So how does this convert to your point, right? Like how does it link to that? So I think the word data has been taken and used for something else, right? If I say data, like, and you say literally your reply would be ML, but that's not it, right? That like data is not just ML, right? It's not just data science. There's a lot more than that. If you obviously, I feel like that when you're in the university, right? So you're looking at multiple different things, and like probably you are getting a lot of your information from YouTube and or like even just the media in general, right? Because the other thing I would add to that is like when you're in university, you're like dealing with a lot of stress of other things as well, right? And you get a lot of unsolicited advice. Like I'll be probably saying that because like we are part of that like DC families, right? We get a lot of unsolicited advice from a lot of our friends and family. So a lot of hype, I think, right now is around a lot of stuff, and probably students also get misjudged because of this hype, right? What I mean by that, right? So if you look at the crypto bubble that formed literally a year or 2 years back, right? So there were a lot of influencers that are pushing this narrative that, oh, this is crypto, this is going to be like this is going to change the world, it's going to change everything, right? And I feel the same thing has been co-opted for data, right? The same grifters that were promoting those crypto schemes and they suddenly lost out, now they're switching towards data, right? So even if you look at the news and stuff like that, right? AI and ML just gets thrown around and data gets like linked somewhere in there, right? So what a student thinks in his mind, right, is that every company out there is doing the like like ML stuff right out of the gate, right? And it's like simple, super easy. Like I can like, and then what happens? Other thing is, right, that you find people that are promoting courses, that are promoting their own like little do it like do this course and you will get a job and stuff like that, right? So there's like a whole, I guess, industry that's feeding off that kind of how can I say it, like not stress but like kind of that unknown thing that students are going through, right? So they get swept up in that media cycle and they're thinking of completely different things when they're entering a company or even the corporate sector or even a startup in general, right? So if you look at data, I think you've worked in data, you know that data is so much more than that, right? It's like a company, like the biggest need for data in a company is reporting, right? You are operating a company, you're running a company, you want to know if you're actually making money or you're losing money, right? If you made a feature, you made a product, it's working well or not, right? So your reporting, your internal metric, those are like the fundamental needs of data. If you are not doing that, you're not going to just start suddenly doing ML and everything else, right? And also I feel with big tech, right, a lot of hype gets generated because of big tech itself, right? You have your Googles and your Facebooks and your Microsoft, right? So there are, I think, only like 10 or 15 companies that are like in the US who are doing like very cutting edge research. But the thing that's happening is, right, those companies get amplified, and those are the only ones we know about, right? There's a whole host of companies out there that probably are not that ahead on the data spectrum, but they are doing good. These are opportunities that people could go into, but they are missing out because they are only thinking getting informed only about this hype thing at this big company. So I think that's a big problem for students right away when they're entering the like starting out in their career.
Yeah, I agree with that. Um, I think this is a good segue, even though not what I originally planned, but I think this is a good segue into what are the major pillars within the data function, right? What different types of roles exist, and maybe like a short, um, what are the differences in skill set required, differences in the kinds of things you will work on? Just a slight overview for the for people who are new to this.
So what I think from your question, right, like is I wanna like touch more on is like what is like what is data in the industry is like, right? Like, okay, let's say you finally somehow or another got in, like, so like, what is something that you can expect right there, right? So I think the first thing I would say that every person starting out should realize is that a business is there to make money, right? The first thing that you should realize that, oh, you want to do data, you want to pursue XYZ stuff, right, is that that business is there to make money. There will always be a hierarchy in that particular company that you're going to, right? There's going to be a C-suite. There are going to be people who have been in the industry for 10 and 20 years or 30 years, right? They know what's going on. So a lot of the decisions will be driven from them, right? So first you think about that, and you also have to think, right, that okay, you were lucky, right, and you got into a company that was technically a tech company, right? Like they had a software product, they were not like a company that was doing offline sales, right? Obviously that would be a lot, there would be a lot more friction in terms of data in that kind of a company, right? But you got into, for example, a software company that was deploying stuff on cloud, right? They was doing relatively, I would say, modern things, right? The product was relatively modern. So even there, right, you have to realize that there is a data like there's a data life cycle, right? It is very like comparable to that software development life cycle, right? That you have a software that you have to build, then first you do a lot of requirement gathering, you talk to customers, you actually like go through a whole plan, right? It's not like you just sit down and are doing like writing code, right? And or like deploying state, right? So state to production. So that is the same thing for data. And I think if you look at the data lifecycle in companies, it's probably a little more removed from their product. Like for example, what I mean by that is you are not producing data right away, right? Because for me, I have always been at companies that are like starting out, right? They have been in business for 6 months, a year, right? So they have just released their product. They're trying to get their traffic to come to to the product they're trying to sell. So they have limited amount of data as is, right? And like whatever data needs that they have are very rudimentary at best, right? They can still run queries on their databases. What they're doing is very rudimentary stuff. They're trying to get started. They're not gonna be doing ML stuff right there and then, right? And most of these companies as well, right? They will be hiring tech talent in a different way. Like they will be looking at tech talent in terms of purely development talent, right? They will be hiring people who are doing building apps or building their website and stuff. They'll not be looking for pure data talent right away, right? So as a person right there, right, you have to realize that a lot of times in your career, you might not be starting just doing data, right? You might have to do a lot of different roles, but and then might be segueing into data. So I think that's what you have to be careful about as well.
Okay. Um, there's one closely related question, right? So you've talked about where it stands today, data roles. There was a question in chat that says, where do you see data-based roles venturing into or evolving as a role in our local industry? So you've talked about current state, but in your opinion, how do you see it evolving over time?
So I guess it depends on industry to industry, right? So most, for example, companies that have been like working for way long, right? So that are probably been in business for like you can say 50 odd years, right? They are very resistant to change as is, right? Because they're probably they're running a business that's very profitable, that's like having a profitability ratio of like 10 or 15%, right? So they don't they are still running on that old mentality, right? Like that their decisions are based more on the thoughts and processes that are being run by their previous generations or stuff like that. Because you have to realize that in Pakistan, right? If you look at in industry in general, a lot of our industry is privately owned businesses that have been running for generations, right? So for them, transitioning and changing is probably not the best, like the thing that's most important from them, right? And probably to that question, I would also add something else, right? As I said, that businesses are there to make money, right? But right now, if you think of data, right, for most companies, data is a very big investment, right? It's the thing is that people think that data is like a panacea, right? Like it's a kind of a magic wand or stuff like that. If I can wave it around, everything can be solved. That's what I meant by my hype machine comment that I made as well. Like there's a lot of hype regarding data and everything else. You have to realize that these companies like Google and Microsoft and like they were they are purely tech companies, right? So first of all, they have that talent, and secondly, their mentality and their way of operation, data is that essential, right? But for companies who have been operating in before and they don't need to be in that kind of frame of mind or frame of operations, for them, data is still very problematic because it's a lot of investment right there and then, right? So I can give you an example. Like say you are a manufacturing company, right? All of the work that you do, all of the data that you have is probably written like ledger. You're keeping it on a ledger. You're writing it down somewhere, right? Or even if you have Excel files, or you're like doing some kind of entry, but you're entering it into your offline systems, right? For a company like that, right, where data is being manually entered by people, right? So there are the whole host of challenges right there. Like there is no data validation input at the input stage, right? You don't know what has been entered into the system. So the process of getting value from your data for you is very long. That value cycle for you is very long. So probably you'll never be in that frame of mind to change that. But if you do go on that path, for you, that path would be like years, not months. It would be like taking you 4 to 5 years just to get derive some value out of your data, right? And the problem with companies is that in 4 or 5 years, like a plan or 4 or 5 years is very difficult to execute, right? Because the other problem then you have to think about is Pakistan in a macroeconomic term, right? When you have so much turbulence going around in general, right? So a project that has to go on for 4 to 5 years doesn't last because probably the people involved in it move around, or the company literally has to have that kind of being tiptoeing, right? Like they find another, they have to find another niche that's probably profitable, right? Because you have in Pakistan, you have cycles coming so soon, right? For example, there is a coup and suddenly a person gets removed, the business is not doing well. So, like, the people in data also have to realize that a lot of times that macroeconomic environment is going to be also dictating a lot of their data life cycle and data journey. So, I have obviously stated a lot of things and added a lot more variability to the question itself. But what I'll probably be saying, what my gist, what you can get from my gist is that probably it's very hard to predict because obviously there is a shift towards that data thing, but you also have to be hyper realistic about what your local market is like, right? You cannot think about the US or like a developed country and just copy over that model. It's not going to be that easy.
That makes sense. Um, I wanted to switch over. There's a few more questions, but we'll look at them in a little bit. I wanted to switch over and get your thoughts about that connection between academia and industry, right? So let's start with academia. What's happening on the data side in universities, in schools, what's being taught, how does that relate to your work? Are we, and then I think one question that I would love to get an answer for in the end of this question is, are we getting the skills that are required in an actual startup data role in school?
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. Uh, but yeah, let me first like literally just talk about academia in general, right? So I think especially for people, I think there might be people here on the call who are from a CS background, right? So for them, it makes the most sense, right? That these are the kind of people who are thinking like, do I even need a degree, right? Like if I'm going into I am literally going for a 4 year degree. I'm spending so much time, money, effort, everything into a degree. Is it even worth it when I'm not learning stuff, right? So I think in that way, you have to realize, right, that the university's job is to make you hireable, right? And for that, there's also like they're going to a 4 year degree. You're not just going there for what you're going to learn. It's also for being able to talk to a lot of like-minded people, right? And it's also trying to add that brand value. So what I mean by that, right, is that you on your own, right, are probably not something a company would be looking at, but like as an institution, right, is if you're like coming from a FAST or an IBA, right, a company is going to be thinking, oh, this guy has come up from this particular like institution. So we have that institution, how can I say, recognition that people from this institution previously have been good enough, right? So that gets added to you. That authority or however, so that brand value gets attached to you as well, right? So that like purely from like if you want to look at it in a utilitarian way, right? That if you want to look in your at your degree in a utilitarian way, right? But you also have to realize that when a university is designing a curriculum and stuff, right? They are catering to a lot more of a diverse diaspora, right? You have people in there who want to like do basic development, who want to do front end, want to do back end stuff, who want to, or like there's a lot of people who don't even know what they want to do, right? So the university will be teaching you a lot of basics. They will not be obviously going into the depths of what you need to know, right? So they will be probably teaching you algorithms, they will be probably teaching you data structures and stuff like that. That probably in my career, I'll be honest, I haven't had the chance to use these things. But yeah, it's good to know them, like in that way, right? But I think what like our colleges or academia is missing is that you also need to have that counseling thing, right? I think that's where like your effort that you're doing with Founder Pakistan is really commendable, right? That you're trying to get people who are literally in academia who are doing their degrees to have a little flavor of what it would be like when they would be going into a professional career, right? So I think the biggest product thing you're missing out in our universities is career counseling, because that is something that I don't see at all or see very minimum, right? So people don't know what careers are available to them, right? They're just thinking, oh, probably I see a guy who is in a software house, or I probably see XYZ person who is doing freelancing, right? But stuff like product and design and that a lot of people can go into, those things are overlooked. And even data as a field gets overlooked, right? Because I realized that I was a person who was passionate about data, and what I felt missing in academia was biggest thing was there was no research orientation, right? If you look in the US and we like compare, oh, they're doing ML and they're doing so great, right? The biggest thing is that academia over there is focused towards research. And the problem that I see, especially in our bachelor's degrees, right? Because there are those are the people starting out, right? That there is no orientation towards research in that time, right? So like people who are doing a 4 year degree, they don't have something else to do on the side. Like it would be great if like they could get some flavor of research as well, right? That's something that you only get introduced to when you're on a master's level or when you go to a PhD program in Pakistan. So that is one thing that obviously missing, but in that way, right? So the best thing that you can do is obviously level up yourself, right? You obviously attend sessions like this, you talk to people in the industry, and you actually hear from them what's needed, right? And you literally take courses and stuff like that on top of that. That's like something that you have to do in general, right? Because that's something that you cannot go without. Then coming to your question of how can somebody learn what they will need in a startup setting. So there is like the first thing I'll say is right on a startup. Even I've been in startups for 3 odd years, right? Even today, I feel that I am out of my depth in a lot of scenarios because yeah, whenever I go out, I have to learn and I have to do that very very fast because obviously it's a first of all you're in tech and data get is very related to that. So you're always new stuff coming out, right? So you're always on the edge in that sense. So there's not like a surefire 100% way of like always being up to date. But I think the mentality that we touched upon previously that's more important is how do you have that mentality of always being there to learn? Like you are always in a position to learn and that you're comfortable being in the operating in the unknown phase, right? So that's probably one of those skills that you definitely need.
Got it. You touched upon like you mentioned courses right now, and then in your introduction you mentioned you did a certification. So we talked about the learning aspect, right? So you go to YouTube, you learn, you go to other places, you learn. There's a, the world now has so much content and so much good content that you can learn on your own. But do you see a benefit of doing formal training outside your university, meaning certifications, courses online? And one, do you see a benefit in the learning aspect? And then number two, do you see a benefit from getting hired perspective? Like, do startups in Pakistan value these things when they're hiring you?
Okay. So I think probably the first thing I would say is that if you look at like trying to get into a role, so I think that startups are those companies or those individuals that are demanding the most out of you. So first of all, because for them they have limited amount of mm, capital and everything, limited resources. So any person that they hire has to be doing a lot of things, right? Then the second thing that you said regarding me also doing certification, so I'll be probably very honest with you in that way, is that I did not derive a lot of value from what I did. So that's very stark and very something that you would not think that I would say, but actually, even the internship that I secured, right, it wasn't due to my certifications or the stuff that I had done before, because I was doing one thing fundamentally very wrong. So what I wanted to touch upon, I think a lot of people are saying that how do you stand out as well, right? Is that you want to also have some place where you can show what you have done, right? So I think LinkedIn for your community building is very important, right? But the second part is your GitHub, right? So in I think a majority of places, especially in startups, data get tagged onto tech. Like data and tech are probably thought of as same thing, right? And a lot of the times you also have to do tech related stuff, and that gets mixed with data as well, right? So for you to actually have a GitHub is very important, right? Any project that you do, you should be hosting over there, right? So one of the fundamental mistakes that I made, right? I did a lot of projects regarding AI, regarding ML and stuff, but I never posted, like I never got around to uploading them on Git, right? So anybody who wanted to interact with them, or like anybody who could have like told me how to do it better, like how I could have built a network effect on top of those projects, I never got to do that because that was a fundamental mistake I made, that I let them be on my local machine. I never pushed it to GitHub. I never got other people's feedback on it, right? So your GitHub is very important for startups, right? Because they actually go to your GitHub, they look at your GitHub, they see if you literally have the talent to write production level code, right? And also probably one thing that gets, like I want to add, that should be a core competency in terms of like you're not just looking at, like for example, you're a data analyst, right? Your day-to-day job is, for example, making dashboard on Tableau or writing query on MySQL or XYZ, right? You know SQL well, for example, you know Tableau very well. But the thing is that when you will be going into a startup, right? So a lot of these startups are going to be hosting everything on cloud, and are going to have a lot of production value stuff that's going on, right? So this is where I'll introduce a very like a term called modern data stack, right? So how modern data stack is different from your previous generation of like how data was done in company, right? It was all on company's own systems, right? So like you had offline servers and you would be doing on a lot of stuff over there, right? In your company's computers that were actually physically located in your company, right? But as we move towards the cloud, right, everything is being hosted on the cloud. So you have these different open source and even closed source software like your Tableaus and stuff, right, that are hosted on cloud, and the, the startup that's running them, right, they also want you to understand that, right? So a great thing that you can do is you can literally follow along how project can be deployed locally on your machine. So I think Docker would be a good technology for a lot of data professionals to learn, because it's normally used mostly in terms of like tech, right? It's mostly used for writing software, but it's something that would be good for you to learn, because why would I say this, right? So you could mimic a literally production running environment in your simple computer if you have it at home, right? So the other aspect of that is like literally you could do a whole data lifecycle on your local machine, right? So what I mean by that is you have a website running on your local machine, right? That has, for example, three different slots, like enter name, enter age, and enter your date of birth, right? So you are literally mimicking a product where a user is entering data. Then that data is, for example, getting collected, is storing on a database. Then from the database, that data is going into like a warehouse that's literally running on your local machine. And then you have a SQL engine on top of that. And lastly, you would have like a simple instance of Apache Superset or XYZ, any kind of data modeling tool that you can learn. So you're technically mimicking this whole thing on your local machine. You're learning a lot of things that you would be learning in a production environment right where you're doing. So my like two cent, like if I would sum it up, is like have a GitHub. I know people would think that a GitHub is only for people who write software or like for developers, but it's also great for people who are working in the data, because data gets shuffled with tech all of the time in startups, right? So a lot of times the people that you have to interview in front of, right? There are people who are core, whose core competency is working in tech. So they'll be looking if you can write software, production level code or production level even queries XYZ. And the second thing that I mentioned about running those projects or like a whole modern data stack project in your local machine, it is using Docker is a great way to get yourself started.
Okay, there's a couple of questions in chat, and we'll be taking more. So if you have any other questions, please put them in chat. There's a question, but I'm going to rephrase it. So the question is, how can you stand out as a fresh graduate when applying for data roles without any prior experience? Do you need relevant work samples? So you kind of answered this already, right? With like the advice for put your projects on GitHub and things like that. There were also other questions that were pre-submitted for this session, that talked about how do we go about building a portfolio. If we don't have any experience, how do we build a portfolio? Everyone advises build a portfolio. How do we do that? So a lot of things around the keyword portfolio. Um, I would love for you to talk about, for someone who has not had an internship yet or a job, how to go about building their portfolio, how to find data sets, what to work on, what to highlight. And then also maybe talk about, because there are non-technical students here too, meaning they aren't studying computer science. Um, how do they go about that if they were, for example, looking for like an analyst role?
Yeah. So I think I have been saying this again and again, and probably sound like a broken record at this point, right? That you always have to have that mentality that I'm able to learn, right? So uh, let me give you an example, right? You're a data analyst and you are thinking that, oh, I should only know SQL. I should only know how to build, for example, a good dashboard. If you want to work at a startup, I'm sorry to burst your bubble again. That's not how your role or how your trajectory is going to go, right? Because you have to realize there's a lot of competition as is, right? And a startup is, again, as I said, is looking for a person who can learn, who can do different things. So a lot of time a data analyst has to be writing their ETL pipelines as well. They are literally having to write literally code to clean their data as well, right? So those things you have to keep in mind as well. Then again, to refine my answer previously, I think I touched a lot about how to build your portfolio. I talked about GitHub. I talked about hosting and everything, hosting it on GitHub and then running Docker and like actually mimicking production environment. So the other thing that like you could probably do to make it even better, right, is like also like if you are coming from a background where you're not tech, right? Like for example, you are saying that you you're a person who got like a small internship in like for example a bank, or like you got something to do with petroleum or XYZ, right? You got to work in a field, right? You're already ahead. Realize this. Like obviously you don't know the technical tools you can learn. But the thing is that you understand the data. So a bigger part of your job is like now that you know how to like how the metrics and everything else works, right? For example, a person who is probably has served in a banking role knows what an approval rate of a like what does approval rate mean by a transaction, right? They know probably what other metrics are looked at in a data setting, right? And now how do you calculate those metrics? And why do you want to look at those? So if you know how to calculate, like know about those numbers, you're already ahead of the game, right? So it's better for you also to look at roles or like a data roles within that field as well, right? Because you understand the data in that role, in that field, in the industry, right? So you only have to learn a few technical tools and that's probably it, right? And to add more to that, right? How to get in, right? That was the question, right? So I would also say, right, probably that you also have to realize that in a lot of places you might not find the perfect role you were looking for, right? there's not going to be always that perfect data role that you thought, or that internship that you thought available for you. So what do you do, right? So if you're a CS grad, you go into that programming as a junior engineer, you go into the company, right? Or like if you are a person who's from that non-tech background, you go in as that management trainee, right? You get into the company, right? You get your foot in the door, and then what you do is that you see a data project, you work for some time, you work for 5 months, you work for 6 months, and then you see a data project is going on, right? Or something comes in, or something to do with data, right? You literally are on the lookout every time, and then you suddenly do a switch. Because the other thing about companies is that I think they are more looking to promote or like upskill people who are in their company rather than start hiring a fresh, right? Because you hire a person, there's like gonna be a waiting period for that person to join, then there's salary issues, X, Y, Z, right? For a company to take on a new employee, it's much more difficult for them, right? But if you're a person who's already there, right, you're a person that they can leverage, that they can literally use for that data role, right? So to add something on top of that is like you have to also realize when you're starting out that your career is going to be very long. It's going to be 20 or 30 odd years, right? You don't need to like be worried that, oh, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be on day one, right? You can be doing a lot of other things starting out, but when you get the chance, when you get the chance to switch, you can switch. So being actually actively in a like and working actively, it's better than just waiting for that perfect role that will be defined for you and just going towards that, right? So getting your foot in the door, I think it's more important than working or having that experience in the data field. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think a couple of things that are underrated, especially at startups, is that they won't have very sophisticated hiring methods. Okay, so what
Yeah,
you can do as a job seeker, as an internship seeker, is like just go talk to people at companies that you're interested in, and you will not only learn a lot about the field and the work they're doing and who they're looking for, but you will also identify, you can, if you are effectively interviewing them, that you can identify the gaps they are looking to fill. Meaning, some companies will have the technical talent that can, write the code and get the data into the right place and clean it and all of that, but they might not have domain experts, meaning who can make good use of that data and make it actionable. Some companies might be the opposite, where they have a bunch of domain experts but they don't have the technical talent needed to instrument the data and get it into clean sources into your warehouse. And so if you can identify, and these are very high level gaps, but you can identify lower level gaps also. But when you identify these, then you can cater your portfolio, your pitch, your resume, to highlight those things that you know how to do them. Or if you don't know how to do them, you can go out and learn how to do those things and then pitch yourself to the startup. So again, there's many ways to go about it. In fact, this week we hired someone at my startup where that person does not know Python, that person does not know Go. That's our tech stack, but we still hired them. And the reason we hired them is because they are a domain expert with health claims data in the US, right? And so they know everything that our company does not understand really well right now about that data source. Like, what does that data mean? How to make sense of it, even though they don't know how to work with our technology stack, but we still hired them. So this happens time and time again. I think all startups will be aiming to fill their gaps, identifying those gaps and filling those gaps. So if you can plug in and understand what those gaps are, you will be successful in your job search. There's another question which I liked, and you've kind of touched upon it, right? So Harika asks, there's a lot of tools in data roles, right? So many ETL tools like Fivetran, Airbyte, Airflow, etc. Many BI tools other than Power BI and Tableau, and different warehouse tools. And so, yeah, the abundance of tools continues to grow. What should be the approach in learning these? Should we stick to some tools and get expert in that and apply for jobs where they use these tools, or should we explore multiple tools? And I think a better question to ask is what are the important things to learn, rather than being tool how do you become tool agnostic, I think, is a better question.
yeah. So I think you've literally just said it is like you have to be tool agnostic, and I think you have to realize what you actually want to do, right? Like even if you look at just the data itself, right? So there are multiple roles, like there is a person who is a data analyst, there's person who's probably an engineer or a data scientist, there's a person who's a data engineer, there's a person who's a data storage engineer. So like different people will touch the data at different times and they will have different value to add to it, right? So Hadika's question, I think, focuses more around like the visualization aspect of it. And I think Haris said the best thing, right? That perhaps it's better for you to have that domain knowledge rather than worry about the tools, right? Because your Tableaus and your Power BIs and your everything would have like very like they would be tools and they would have some things that are very similar in all of them. So like for you to learn them is not going to take time. For you to actually understand the data of the company that you want to go into or to actually understand the field, that's more important, right? So even if you know one tool, that's fine. And that's what I told that that's what my reason for saying Docker was there, because like you also want to in your person who you're looking for, right? You want to see that they have the technical ability, right? They can understand stuff a little bit, that's techy, but they also know how things would be functioning like if it was production, right? So that's what I meant by actually not going to a company, but actually mimicking what they would be doing, right? So you can find, I think, tons of projects that actually do this, and like that would be, I think, a great starting point for a lot of people. Just like learn one or two tools. I'm not saying that like worry more about tools. It's more about how you can literally get that experience of without actually being in a company. That's what we're trying to do, right?
Okay. There's some tactical questions which I think we've touched upon a little bit, but maybe if you could be a little bit more specific about people who are looking for data analyst roles and don't know that skill set. Like what should they go out and search for and learn? Any like key 2 or 3 skills that you've seen that every data analyst has that people should pick up before they start their job search?
Yeah, so I think for specifically for data analysts, I think the first part is that your communication, right? I think your for data analysts, I think a soft skills are something that probably more important than probably a person who is just like a data engineer, right? So if you're comparing those two roles, for them having that way to communicate people with people, and then also having a kind of design sense. I think a design sense is also important because, like, obviously, then again, when a data analyst has to present a lot of things to a lot of people, right? Or a lot of people have to use stuff that they like data analysts have created to actually show, like as I said, like reporting is a very important part of almost every business, right? So I think communications and having a design sense, then obviously you can learn your SQL and your Excel things, right? Like how to write queries. And then as you grow, as you grow into that role, right? And as you become a more senior like data analyst, right? You obviously also think about how you can get better at like writing the SQL query, right? Because a lot of the times you're like literally just writing stuff that's computationally intensive, right? But you can also transition a little bit towards that actual engineering side as well, because literally you can make the work of your data engineers and people before you in that data value chain, right? Data analysts come at a very like a later part of the data value chain. How you can make the lives of those people easier, right? So I think for data analyst, give me a minute. Sorry about that. So for data analyst, I think that is a role that also requires a lot more soft skills as well as compared to just like tech stuff.
Okay, we're almost at time, and we've covered all of the questions that we got. So I think we will close it out here. So a couple of notes, because we were just talking about the soft skills for data analysts. Next month we have one guest speaker from Colombia who is talking about communicating with your stakeholders as a data analyst, right? So how do you make stakeholder-friendly presentations and communicate with them effectively? That's going to be coming up next month. The page for it will be launched in a day or two. As a reminder to everyone who is still on the call, if you are looking for a job as a new data analyst or data engineer, there's a bunch of internship and jobs posted at jobs.founderpakistan.com. So please check that out. Thank you so much, Mohammad Abubakr, for sharing your experiences and guiding all of our community members to find their first data role or transition into data. Thank you. Thanks everyone for
Thank
joining.
you for having me.